Hamujambo. In Africa, in Kenya especially, we say jambo, East and Central Africa, and then the other people say jambo. Jambo, thank you very much. My name's Daniel Kobei from the Ogiek Peoples from Kenya. I'm here to speak on behalf of Africa on the preparatory meeting which we had in Nairobi in the month of November 20th to 21st. And I wish to first of all thank the co-chairs for giving us this opportunity. And I extend also our thanks to the Sami government, or rather the Norwegian government, the Sami parliament for their hospitality extended to us in Africa, for having to participate in this meeting. And we are grateful that we have gotten a chance as Africa to be able to present the outcome of our meeting. And one unique thing is that this is a very special opportunity for us to having come to a country where there is no night this time. It is very unique for some of us. It's a historical. We have something to report back home that we never saw the night for the period we were here. This is something we can never forget to say. Fellow participants, representatives from indigenous people from the 5 regions of Africa, we had a meeting from the 5 regions where there were 17 countries in Africa which were represented, with over 40 participants who attended the meeting in Nairobi. And we had a 2-day meeting, and we came up with our draft document, which has been presented to the Alta draft document. The representatives welcomed the opportunity to raise the voices of Africa, indigenous people, as part of the preparatory process for the high level in the UN General Assembly to be held on indigenous as approved in the General Assembly A65-198. We welcome that African indigenous people representatives participating in the process toward the World Conference to present a unified voice while recognizing the regional linguistic and livelihood diversity of African indigenous communities. The model effective and equitable inclusion of women and youth in African delegations, which we have seen today. We seek dialogue with the state actors and during the conference in the issue relevant to the indigenous people. We also seek practical and concrete outcomes from the World Conference in relation to the commitment and proposed action from the United Nations bodies, national government and human rights institutions, such as the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Encourage African indigenous people representatives participating in the process towards the World Conference in the World Conference itself to advocate for substantive discussion of the following priority concerns of African indigenous peoples. First is to right to land and productive resources, specifically including territorial recognition, free, prior, and informed consent, benefit sharing, and evictions. As all of us, we are aware, Africa has undergone a lot of evictions in most areas. We have seen especially the areas like in Ngorongoro in Tanzania, the Ogiek of Kenya, and even the son of Botswana. There we have had all these problems undergoing on issues related to evictions. Conflict and impact of indigenous people. We have had a lot of conflict and impacts of indigenous, which has impacted indigenous people. We talk about the Tuareg people in the Sahel region in Northern Africa, where they have had a lot of conflict, and it has impacted a lot to the indigenous peoples. Discrimination, both direct and indirect, which has been felt, and it has really impacted on the Africa. Environmental justice, including climate change and destruction of natural environment upon which indigenous peoples depend. Conduct of multinational corporations and conservation organizations in relation to the indigenous people, communities, and lands. especially the link between the actions and omission of governments and these actors. Impunity for human rights violations, which is common in Africa, especially extrajudicial killings and enforcement of decisions and judgment that violate indigenous peoples' rights. Denial of the right to political and legislation recognition, representation and participation, also including language recognition, marginalization from social services with priority on education and health, rights of indigenous women, including concerns over harmful practices, rights of widows, and the impact of displacement and the conflict on women and girls. These are all being felt in Africa, and we need some action. Right of indigenous people to receive information. Right of indigenous people to receive information, which sometimes lacks both nationally and internationally, and this is something to be considered. Right of indigenous peoples to promote and practice their culture and religion. The mandate African indigenous people representatives participating in the process toward the World Conference to seek inclusion in the outcome document of the following commitment on action. Reaffirm the indigenous individuals and groups are entitled to full enjoyment and effective implementation of all human rights recognized in international law. Reaffirm the rights recognized the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, constitute of minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of indigenous peoples of the world. Recall that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People obliges states, consultation and cooperation with indigenous people concerned to take measures, including legislative measures, to achieve the ends of this declaration, and recognizing the substantive work of African Commission and its working group on indigenous peoples and communities in clarifying the characteristic concerns of indigenous people in Africa and in elaborating the obligation of African states in relation to indigenous peoples. And we call on African states to adopt the specific legal framework that recognizes, protect, and promote indigenous peoples as rights holders, including the ratification of ILO Convention. Reaffirm the commitment to respect, protect, and fulfill the right of African indigenous people enshrined in African Charter on Human and People's Rights and its associated protocols. Some of the key areas we looked at are right to land and productive resources, specifically including territorial recognition, free and prior informed consent, and benefit sharing and eviction, which I have already said that, recalling that as clarified by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, a key characteristic of indigenous people in Africa is that they occupy and use specific territory, in many cases have a sacred relationship with their ancestral land. This, recognizing that control over and access to traditional territories enables them to freely pursue their traditional livelihood and economic, social, and cultural development, including the maintaining and strengthening food security in accordance to their own aspiration and needs. We also look at the conflict and its impact on indigenous peoples, that recognizing the right of indigenous people to peace and security, that noting the multiple causes, types, and impact of conflict in the African context, including the violation of human rights, humanitarian law, and massive scale attacks by government and security forces upon their own citizens, attacks by paramilitary militia groups, criminal gangs, localized conflict between communities, and related violence. So we call on state to provide security to indigenous peoples while respecting the human rights of all indigenous peoples and taking special measures to ensure protection for indigenous women and children. Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination. Reaffirm the commitment of state to fulfill their obligation to promote universal respect for and observance and protection of human rights, fundamental freedom for all in accordance with the Charter of United Nations, other instruments relating to human rights and international law. Environmental justice, including climate change and destruction of natural environment upon which indigenous people depend, taking into consideration the Malabo African Union General Decision to ensure that African interest on green economy issues within context of sustainable development, poverty eradication, institutional framework for sustainable development are defined and taken into account. Discrimination, which is both direct and indirect, reaffirming the indigenous people are free and equal to other peoples, and that indigenous peoples, in the exercise of their rights, including their human rights, shall be free from discrimination and of any kind, in particular discrimination that is based on indigenous origin or identity. We express grave concern in relation to discrimination against indigenous peoples in Africa, including state policies, and fail to recognize or accommodate indigenous languages, discriminatory treatment of state, non-state actors in education, employment, health care, and access to services, lack of access to identity document, and other form of discrimination. We can say you that sometime in Africa it's very hard for indigenous people even to get passports or identity cards in their specific countries, and this should come to an end. Conduct of multinational corporations concerning organization is relation to indigenous peoples and land, recognizing the close link between actions and omissions of governments and activities of multinational corporations and conservation organizations in Africa. We recognize the further that indigenous people are in vulnerable position vis-a-vis private entities, often lacking the resources and capacity to present themselves adequately in relations or negotiations with private industry, parastatals, and conservation. Impunity for human rights violations, especially extrajudicial killings, enforcement of decision, judgment, and vindicate indigenous people's rights. We have also what we call denial of rights to political and legislative recognition, representation, and participation. We reaffirm that the right of indigenous people to particular in political and cultural rights for his and his own community, as well as political life of nations and as a whole. And finally, marginalization from social service with priority to education and health and right of indigenous women and girls. Thank you very much.